In 1984, a quiet school janitor locks up for the summer after the final bell and is never seen again, leaving behind only a mop bucket and rumors that quickly fade. 13 years later, a new custodian accidentally opens a sealed supply closet, and what he finds inside reignites a forgotten mystery, exposing a buried crime, a shameful cover-up, and the dark truth hidden within the school's walls. The bell rang for the final time that year, echoing down the empty corridors of Eisenhower High like a fading heartbeat. Lockers slammed, laughter spilled into the humid Arkansas air. The school emptied in waves of students and teachers eager for summer. But one man remained behind, pushing his mop slowly down the East Wing hallway, alone. Harold Granger had worked at the school for nearly a decade. He was the kind of man who went unnoticed, quiet, dependable, always with a ring of keys at his hip and a thermos of black coffee cooling by a dusty window. Most students never learned his name. Some thought he lived in the basement. Others said he didn't talk because something happened to him in the war. But no one really knew, and no one really asked. That afternoon, Harold never made it to the parking lot. His old Ford truck sat idle under the oak tree near the loading dock. The front office assumed he'd forgotten something and would be back. When days passed and the truck remained, someone finally called the sheriff. A missing persons report was filed, barely a paragraph long. No family, no next of kin, no suspects. Within a week, the story faded. 13 years later, in the sweltering summer of 1997, Luis Rivera stood holding a ring of keys that weren't his. The building manager had been out sick, and Luis, hired only a month earlier, had been asked to prep the supply closets ahead of the new semester. He didn't notice the odd key until it turned. Not in the janitorial room near the gym or the ones near the cafeteria, but a narrow closet door beside the old auditorium, one he'd never seen used. The lock groaned. The door stuck, as if something behind it hadn't moved in years. When it finally gave way, a rush of air hit him dry, stale, tinged with metal. The light inside flickered once, then steadied, revealing a cramped room coated in dust. Mops, buckets, rusted shelving, nothing unusual. Until he saw it. An old folded work shirt slumped in the corner, stained dark across the chest. A faded name patch still clung to the breast pocket. Harold. And beneath it, something that looked an awful lot like dried blood. Luis didn't move for a long time. The shirt sat there like a discarded skin, folded but deflated, its sleeves limp, and the fabric stiff in places where time had dried it solid. He crouched, cautiously, and reached out. The dark maroon stain across the chest wasn't dirt. He didn't have to touch it to know. There was an edge to the smell, faint, metallic, and ancient, that turned the back of his throat raw. The name patch, still barely legible, read Harold. No last name, just Harold. Luis stood and scanned the closet again. It wasn't large, barely wide enough for two people to stand shoulder to shoulder. Shelves lined each side, stacked with brittle paper towels, disintegrating gloves, and cleaning supplies long expired. But something about the room felt wrong. Not just old, abandoned. Like no one had entered since the Reagan years. Dust coated everything in a fine gray layer. Even the air felt thick with it. There was no cobweb at the top of the doorframe, no footprints leading in. Luis glanced down at his own, fresh in the dust, breaking years of untouched silence. He backed out slowly and closed the door with a soft click, like sealing a vault. He made his way to the main office, unsure what to say. The summer staff was minimalist, the assistant principal and a secretary tapping at a computer. Luis cleared his throat, then mentioned the shirt. The name. The stain. They exchanged a look, confused, almost bored. "Harold?" the secretary said, frowning faintly. "That old janitor? Didn't he just leave?" The assistant principal, Mr. Corman, rubbed his temple. "That was forever ago," he muttered. "I thought he quit, or moved. You found a shirt?" Luis nodded. "There's more than a shirt." Corman sighed. "I'll file something. But we're talking about a guy who vanished 13 years ago. There's not much to do about that now." That night, Luis lay awake in his apartment, replaying the moment the door opened. The way the light flickered, the air, the silence, and the way the name Harold had stared back at him like it had been waiting. The next morning, Luis returned early, well before the rest of the summer crew filtered in. He couldn't stop thinking about the close how undisturbed it felt, like it had been sealed shut on purpose. Not forgotten, but hidden. He brought a flashlight this time and a pair of gloves. The key still fit smoothly, and when the door swung open again, the air was just as heavy as before. He stepped inside and crouched by the shirt. The blood, if that's what it was, shad darkened into something brittle. He lifted the fabric gently, revealing the concrete beneath, stained and cracked. Something had happened here. He was sure of it now. Pushed farther into the corner was a small, rusted nameplate, detached from a locker or maybe a uniform. The last name read, Granger. That was it, Harold Granger. Luis whispered the name like a question. It felt strange in the air, like it didn't belong in this decade. A sharp creak sounded behind him. He turned, heart pounding, but the hallway outside was empty. Just the buzz of overhead lights and the distant hum of a floor buffer in the cafeteria. Later that day, Luis brought it up again. The name, the closet, the shirt. He asked a few teachers who had stopped by to check their classrooms. Most didn't remember Harold at all. One math teacher vaguely recalled a janitor who was real quiet. Another shrugged. "I think he left after that one summer, just stopped showing up." But then there was Mrs. Delaney. She'd been teaching English there since 1975. Older now, gray hair pinned back in a tight twist, and eyes that missed nothing. When Luis mentioned the name, she went still. "Harold Granger?" she said slowly, like dusting off an old photo. "He never left." Luis blinked. "Sorry?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced down the hall, then leaned in closer. "Some closets were locked for a reason," she whispered. "Sometimes people disappear because others want them to." He asked her what she meant, but she waved him off, already walking away. "You work here long enough," she called over her shoulder. "You learn when to leave certain things alone." But Luis didn't want to leave it alone. Not anymore. Luis waited until the building emptied again. Summer schedules made that easy. By 3 p.m., the last staffer was usually out the door. He stayed behind under the pretense of waxing the east wing floors, but headed straight for the maintenance office instead. There was a filing cabinet in the back, mostly used for outdated manuals and old supply orders. But he'd noticed a bottom drawer labeled Employee Records Archive. The folders inside were brittle with age, edges curled, the paper yellowing. It took him a minute, but he found one labeled Granger Harold E. Inside, a photocopied ID, a brief employment record, and a handwritten personnel review dated spring 1984. Reliable, quiet, keeps to himself. No disciplinary notes, no complaints. Just a check mark beside, does not return contract offer. Scribbled beside it, barely legible, presumed voluntary resignation, no contact since June. Luis stared at it. That was it? A man vanished, and they called it voluntary? He kept reading. Attached was a supply inventory log from Harold's last week. It listed a mop cart, 3 brooms, floor cleaner, and a key checkout form. One key was marked unreturned, A wing custodial supply room, the very closet Luis had opened. He sat back in the cracked vinyl chair, pulse ticking faster now. If Harold had vanished, and that key never came back, had anyone even checked the closet? A sound outside the office made him jump. Just the building settling, maybe, or the echo of memory. Luis tucked the folder into his backpack. At home, he spread the documents across his kitchen table. His girlfriend Marisol leaned over his shoulder, reading in silence. "You think this guy died in that closet?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Luis said. but I think someone knew he didn't leave on his own." Marisol touched the shirt he'd bagged in plastic and frowned. "That blood looks real." "I'm not crazy, right?" he asked. "No," she said, "but if someone went this far to hide it, they won't want it found now." Luis looked back at the nameplate. Granger. The man had vanished behind a locked door. And now, 13 years later, it was finally open again. Luis brought the shirt to the police the next morning, sealed in a clear plastic storage bag. The officer at the front desk barely looked up from his crossword. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, squinting at the stain through the bag. "Inside a sealed supply closet at Eisenhower High," Luis said. "It belonged to a janitor who disappeared in '84. I think it might be blood." The officer sighed. "You got a name?" "Harold Granger." The man flipped through a 3-ring binder with outdated report numbers and shrugged. "Doesn't look like we've got an open file. That long ago, probably closed as a walk-off. People left all the time back then." Luis stared at him. "He left his truck in the parking lot. Never clocked out. Didn't cash his last check." The officer scratched his cheek and looked down at the shirt again. "You said the closet was sealed?" "Yeah. Locked, then welded shut a year later. No one touched it for over a decade." The officer finally stood. "I'll pass it on to the detectives, but don't expect miracles. Not much we can do without a body." Luis left the station more frustrated than relieved. Back at the school, the building felt colder, emptier somehow, even in the Arkansas heat. Shadows stretched longer in the east wing hallway, and every sound seemed sharper: the hiss of the AC, the creak of a distant locker, his own breath. That afternoon, he found Mrs. Delaney again, grading papers in an empty classroom. The door was open, sunlight catching the dust motes floating above her head. "I found Harold's file," he said from the doorway. "And his key, his shirt. I think something happened to him." She looked up slowly. Her expression softened, not surprised, but tired. "You're not the first person to wonder," she said, "just the first to care enough to do something." Luis stepped in. "What happened to him?" Delaney hesitated, then motioned for him to close the door. "I don't know the whole story," she said. "But I remember that summer. He was scared, real quiet, even more than usual. Kept saying he saw something he shouldn't have." Luis leaned in. "What did he see?" She looked toward the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that made him a problem." Luis sat in his car after the conversation with Mrs. Delaney, the engine off, windows down, listening to the cicadas scream from the trees beyond the parking lot. A problem, that word kept echoing. Not an accident, not a disappearance, a problem. The kind of word people use when someone gets in the way. He stayed late again that night, walking the halls like a ghost in his own building. The East Wing had started to feel different, like the walls were holding their breath. He retraced Harold's likely path, from the boiler room to the janitor's closet past the old gym. The floors creaked in places they shouldn't have. The lights flickered once near room 112 and then went dark completely for a moment before humming back on. Something else had been nagging at him. The closet Harold was found in, according to the blueprints Luis had found in the basement office, used to be part of a larger space. A wide utility room, spanning the wall from the auditorium to the locker rooms. But sometime in the mid-'80s, part of it had been walled off, split into separate sections. No explanation in the construction notes. No records of permits. Just sealed, like the school wanted to forget it ever existed. He went down to the sublevel, where the old boiler still hissed in its cage. No one used this part of the school anymore. It smelled like rust and mildew, the kind of damp that never really dried out. Luis shined his flashlight across the walls, looking for seams, strange edges, anything unnatural. And then he saw it. A faint rectangle in the paint, different texture, slightly off color, a patch in the concrete. The shape of a door, long since bricked over. No handle, no hinges, just the ghost of an entryway. Luis stepped closer, ran his hand along the wall. It was cold, too cold. The air down here was stagnant, but near that wall it felt like a cellar, like something deep and forgotten was leaking through. He took a shaky breath, stepped back, and snapped a photo. He didn't know what was behind it yet, but something told him Harold Granger had never walked out of this school. Not through the front door, anyway. The next day, Luis printed out the photo of the sealed doorway and slipped it into a manila folder, along with Harold's file and the other photos he'd taken. He stared at the stack of documents spread across the teacher's lounge table, each one a thread in something tangled and unfinished. If no one else was going to pull them together, he would. The only problem was every road seemed to end in silence. The school district office didn't have any construction records for that section of the building. No permits, no blueprints showing renovations past 1985. The woman at the front desk said things like that got lost all the time in the transition from paper to digital. When Luis pressed her, she glanced around and lowered her voice. You know how it was back then. Principals had a lot more leeway. If something needed to be done off the books, it got done. Who was principal in '84? She tapped a few keys. Bellamy. Richard Bellamy. Retired in '86. Died a few years ago, I think. Luis thanked her and walked out, but the name stuck in his head. Bellamy. It wasn't just that he'd been in charge during Harold's disappearance, it was the way everyone talked about him. Like a man who didn't like questions. That night, he sat with Marisol at their kitchen table again, laying out everything he'd found. This looks bad, she said, thumbing through the photos. This patch in the wall there? You sure it used to be a door? Luis nodded. Blueprints from '83 show a full-sized entry. That patch wasn't there until after Harold vanished. And no one ever looked into it? They just let it go, Luis said. A janitor goes missing, and nobody looks. He didn't have anyone, no family, no one to make noise. Marisol looked at the photo of Harold's nameplate, her voice soft. So, he just vanished, and they bricked him behind a wall. Luis didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight of it sat between them, thick and unspoken. He glanced back at the wall and the photo's uneven texture, the faint curve of old paint. Somewhere behind it was the truth, and he wasn't going to stop until he found it. Luis returned to the school on Saturday, early enough that the building still felt half asleep. The parking lot was empty, save for a single rusted pickup near the football field and a squirrel darting along the sidewalk. He used the side entrance near the gym, the one closest to the old utility corridors. No staff, no students, just silence. He made his way to the sub-level again, flashlight in hand, a flathead screwdriver tucked into his back pocket. The patched-over doorway waited for him, just as he'd left it. Only this time, he wasn't just looking. He tapped the wall gently, listening. Most of it rang solid, but the area near the base dead, hollow. He crouched and pried at a small crack where the paint had chipped. A sliver of concrete flaked away. Beneath it, a layer of brick, discolored and old. He was so focused, he didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost on top of him. A voice behind him cleared its throat. I really hoped nobody would ever find that again. Luis spun around, heart in his throat. A man stood in the corridor, maybe in his late 50s, wiry frame, hair thinned at the temples. His maintenance badge read, D. Haskins. Luis straightened. You worked here back then? Haskins gave a short nod, eyes fixed on the wall. Started in '83. I was the youngest on the crew. Harold trained me. Luis waited, but the man didn't go on. Do you know what happened to him? A pause. Then Haskins laughed oncidry, bitter. I know he didn't walk away. Luis stepped aside, gesturing toward the patch. Is that where? I don't know what's behind it, Haskins said, but I know the day that wall went up we were told to leave early. All of us. Union meeting, they said. But there was no meeting. The next morning, that whole section was bricked shut and painted over. Bellamy? Luis asked. Haskins nodded. Him and the district guy. Real quiet. Never explained. Luis exhaled, a chill blooming in his chest. Why didn't you say anything? I was 19, Haskins said, voice low. And I wanted to keep my job. He looked at Luis, then hard, steady. You really want to open that wall? He asked. Luis didn't blink. Yes. Haskins didn't argue. He just looked at Luis for a long moment, then stepped forward and knelt beside the wall. He ran his hand along the bricks like someone brushing dust off an old headstone. I told myself it wasn't my business, he said quietly. But I still dream about it sometimes. Him mopping that hallway, the way he looked at people, like he knew something but didn't dare say it. Luis stood beside him, the flashlight casting long shadows across the uneven surface. Do you think he saw something? Luis asked. Haskins nodded slowly. He said something to me once. Just once, day before he vanished. Told me not to trust what I hear upstairs. Said there were things at this school that were better left unseen. I didn't understand then. Luis looked back toward the hallway. It was quiet, but the silence felt heavier now, like the building itself was listening. I think he tried to do the right thing, Haskins added, and it cost him. They worked for nearly an hour. The screwdriver wasn't enough, so Luis borrowed a small chisel and hammer from the maintenance shed. The bricks chipped away slowly, stubborn in their age. Behind the first few layers was a frame metal, rusted, unmistakably part of a door once bolted shut and forgotten. The smell came next faint, earthy but wrong, not just age, decay. Luis stepped back, chest tight. Something's behind there, he said. Haskins didn't answer, just kept working. He chipped away another brick, then another, until finally they could see a sliver of darkness through a gap in the wall, a void. Luis turned off the flashlight and held his breath. Nothing. No sound, no movement. He reached through the gap with the beam and swept it around slowly. The light passed over what looked like shelves, maybe old equipment. Then it caught something that didn't belong. A shoe. Small, faded, cracked with age. Luis froze. Is that? Haskins started, but he didn't finish. The air felt colder now. The kind of cold that settles into the back of your throat and tells you you've crossed into something final. Luis lowered the light and stepped back. They weren't just peeling back bricks. They were peeling back a secret. Luis didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The image of that shoe burned into his mind. It wasn't just old, it looked like it had been left in a hurry, tipped sideways, laces tangled. Dust coated it like sediment in a sealed tomb. By morning, the weight of it pressed hard enough on his chest that he knew he had no choice. He needed to go further. He called in sick and returned to the school just after sunrise, parking around back where no one would see. Haskins was already waiting near the maintenance shed, holding a crowbar and a small pry hammer like tools for exhumation. Neither of them spoke. Back in the sublevel, the air was thick again, as if disturbed by what they'd found. The wall gaped slightly wider, now just enough to see that the hidden room beyond wasn't storage. It was more like a cavity. The remnants of something forgotten. Luis worked while Haskins kept watch. More bricks crumbled away. The opening grew large enough to crawl through. Luis didn't hesitate. He slid inside, flashlight sweeping through the space. Shelving units, buckled with age, lined the far wall. Empty bleach bottles. A rusted mop wringer. But then, just beyond that, half covered by a collapsed crate, lay something that stopped him cold. A jumpsuit. Gray-blue, torn at the collar. The patch on the chest was faded almost beyond recognition, but Luis didn't need to read it. He knew it was Harold's. He crouched slowly, heart pounding in his ears. A few feet away, near the far corner of the room, something else shimmered in the beam of his light. A chain, rusted, looping through a steel anchor in the floor, and connected to it, too small to be a person, but unmistakable in its shape, was a set of keys. Harold's keys. Luis reached out but stopped short. Not from fear exactly, but reverence. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a grave. He turned toward the gap in the wall where Haskins watched from the other side, his face pale. "I need to call the police," Luis said quietly. "Now." And this time, he didn't care if they believed him, because Harold Granger had never left this school. He had been sealed inside it. The detective who showed up looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mid-40s, too much cologne, sunglasses he didn't bother to remove even indoors. His badge read, "Det. Carl Dempsey," and his tone fell somewhere between skepticism and annoyance. "You're saying you found what exactly?" he asked, glancing into the dark gap Luis had widened. "A sealed room," Luis said, "with a uniform, a chain, keys, and what looks like remains." Dempsey sighed, like he'd just been asked to write someone up for loitering. "This Janitor Granger? You said he disappeared 13 years ago?" "Yes, and no one ever investigated it." "Not really." Dempsey shined his flashlight through the gap and gave a low whistle. "Well, damn, that's definitely not up to code." He didn't go inside. Instead, he made a call, ordered the scene taped off, and told Luis and Haskins to wait outside. Within an hour, more units arrived, 2 cruisers, a plain white van, and a forensics team that treated the basement like they were entering a tomb. Luis sat on the curb near the gym, hands folded, the heat baking the pavement underfoot. Haskins stood nearby, arms crossed, watching everything like a man who'd seen this coming but still couldn't believe it. Eventually, Dempsey returned, his sunglasses finally off, his eyes more alert now. "They found human remains," he said. "Mostly skeletal. We'll need dental records, maybe DNA, but given what you've told me, yeah, looks like you found your missing janitor." Luis felt something tighten and release in his chest at the same time. Grief, maybe, or relief, or both. Dempsey flipped open a notepad. "Tell me again how you found this. From the beginning." Luis did. The closet, the shirt, the blood, the blueprints. He told him about the wall that shouldn't have been there, the unreturned key, the way everyone just let Harold's name fade into dust. Dempsey scribbled something down. "You'll need to be available for follow-ups. Might be a homicide investigation now." "Might be?" Luis said, voice flat. Dempsey shrugged. "No weapon, no witnesses. And the man's been dead longer than most of our records go back. Sometimes, cases like this don't go anywhere." Luis didn't reply. He just looked back toward the building, where Harold had been entombed beneath layers of silence. Going nowhere wasn't an option anymore. By Monday morning, the school was no longer quiet. Yellow police tape stretched across the east wing, and word had already made its way through town. Eisenhower High, the place of pep rallies and parent-teacher nights, was now the center of a death investigation. Teachers showed up early to whisper behind closed doors. A news van parked across the street. And students, those few who came for summer programs, stood on tiptoe trying to peer through the locked doors. Luis kept his head down and went about his rounds, but the questions followed him everywhere. Is it true? Did you really find a body? Was it murder? No one asked about Harold. At lunch, Luis sat alone in the break room, watching the local news anchor deliver a cautious report. Human remains were discovered beneath Eisenhower High School this weekend. Authorities have not confirmed the identity, but sources suggest the remains may belong to a former employee who disappeared in 1984. Marisol called that afternoon, her voice tight. "They're talking about it on the radio. Some people think you're making it up." "I didn't make anything up," Luis said. "I know, but you stirred something people wanted left buried." Later that day, a detective from the cold case unit arrived on an older woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone. Detective Leah Madden. She introduced herself and asked to walk the building with Luis. Unlike Dempsey, she took notes without sighing and asked questions that didn't feel dismissive. "Tell me about this room," she said, standing at the closet Luis had first unlocked. "It was sealed," he said, and forgotten, until it wasn't. She ran her hand over the frame. Rooms don't seal themselves. Someone made a decision, someone signed off. Louise nodded slowly. The principal back then, Richard Bellamy. Madden paused. He passed away, didn't he? Yeah, but people remember him. She glanced back at the yellow tape further down the hallway. Someone else will too. As she walked away, Louise leaned against the cool cinder-block wall, eyes fixed on the floor that had once been Harold's route. Push the mop, change the bulbs, fix the leaks, keep your head down. Then vanish. But Harold hadn't vanished. He'd been erased. And now someone would have to answer for that. Louise didn't mean to become the face of it. But by Tuesday, people had started treating him like the story belonged to him. A teacher in the parking lot asked if he was the one who found the skeleton. A student handed him a folded note that read, "Thank you for not forgetting him," and, later that afternoon, the principal, Mr. Kinney, young, polite, and clearly overwhelmed, asked Louise to step into his office. "We've had inquiries," Kinney said, gesturing vaguely to a stack of phone messages. "Media, former staff, alumni, people want answers." Louise just nodded. What was he supposed to say? "Your building had a man's grave sealed behind drywall for over a decade. Sorry for the inconvenience." Kinney cleared his throat. "We're cooperating with investigators fully, but unofficially, people are starting to wonder what exactly Harold Granger knew, what he saw." Louise folded his arms. "You think he was killed because of something he found out?" Kinney looked like he wanted to say no, but couldn't. "I've spoken to 2 retired teachers who were here in '84. They both said the same thing. Harold was nervous that spring, kept asking questions, said something about the gym and a fire." Louis straightened. "There was a fire. I found it in the maintenance logs, small, contained in a supply room. Harold put it out." "Maybe that's where it started," Kinney said softly. "Maybe he saw who caused it." Louis left the office with that thought rattling around in his head. Not an accident, not a disappearance. Something set in motion the moment Harold saw something he shouldn't have and made the mistake of trying to do the right thing. That night, Louis dug deeper. He pulled the maintenance records from 1983, yellowed and faded, scanned them line by line until he found it. March 12, 1983, minor fire reported in gym storage, extinguished by H. Granger. Cause, undetermined. In the margins, scribbled in blue ink, Harold says he saw 2 students near the door minutes before, told Bellamy. Nothing followed up. Louis ran his finger along the page. 2 students, a fire, a warning ignored. And, months later, Harold Granger would vanish behind a wall. It was never about the fire. It was about what came after. Louis found the yearbook the next morning, tucked in a dusty cabinet in the library's back room, Eisenhower High, class of '84, thick cover, gold embossed lettering, edges worn soft by time. He carried it to a table and flipped to the student index, finger tracing down the names until he hit the section labeled Seniors. He didn't know what he was looking for, exactly just a feeling. 2 students, maybe football players, maybe not. Someone with a reason to cover their tracks, someone Principal Bellamy would protect. The sports section caught his eye, page after page of smiling boys in shoulder pads, their names printed in block letters underneath. One photo in particular made him pause. Mark Tolbert, quarterback. Blonde, square-jawed, eyes like a dare. Captain of the team, voted most likely to succeed. The kind of kid every small-town principal would bend over backwards to protect. Louis kept flipping. There he was again, Tolbert at the pep rally, Tolbert with the homecoming queen, Tolbert standing just behind Principal Bellamy in a blurry staff appreciation photo. Always in the background, always with a hand on someone's shoulder. Another name stood out in the gym club photo, Dean Klein. Tall, thinner, forgettable face. No accolades, no bold lettering, but he stood next to Tolbert in every shot. a shadow. Luis jotted both names down. He found Mrs. Delaney during her prep period, sipping coffee in an empty classroom. He placed the yearbook gently on her desk. "Do you remember him?" he asked, pointing at Tolbert. She stared at the photo for a long time before answering. Yes, Mark was. Protected, came from one of the bigger families in town. The Tolberts ran the lumber yard. Bellamy kept him close. And Dean Klein? Her lips pressed thin, quieter, always following Mark around like a dog. I think he wanted to be liked more than he wanted to be good. Luis showed her the note about the gym fire. You think they were the ones Harold saw? She didn't answer right away. Then she looked Luis dead in the eye. I think Harold saw something that made him dangerous to people who had power, she said, and I think this town was more interested in preserving its image than protecting the truth. Luis closed the yearbook. He finally had names. Now he needed answers. Luis drove out to the edge of town that afternoon, where the pavement turned to gravel and the trees began to lean in closer. The Tolbert name was still visible on the old lumber yard sign, though the paint had faded and one corner hung loose in the wind. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a locked gate, maybe nothing at all, but the yard was open, the office light on, and a battered pickup parked out front. Inside, the air smelled like sawdust and motor oil. A man sat behind the counter, hunched over an order form, thick hands stained with grease, hair gone to gray. "Can I help you?" he asked, not looking up. "Mark Tolbert?" Luis asked. The man paused, then slowly raised his head. It was Himmelder, heavier, but unmistakable. The eyes were the same, still sharp, still distant. "Yeah, who's asking?" "My name's Luis Rivera. I work maintenance at Eisenhower High. I think we need to talk about Harold Granger." For a beat, nothing moved. Then Mark leaned back in his chair and gave a short, humorless laugh. "Took you long enough." Luis frowned. "So you know why I'm here?" Mark looked past him, out the window toward the rows of stacked lumber. "I figured someone would come eventually. Thought maybe the cops, not the janitor." Luis stepped closer. "Harold saw something the night of that fire, didn't he? Something you and Dean didn't want him to." Mark's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago. He died because of it." "I didn't kill him," Mark said quickly, like he'd rehearsed the line. "We were just trying to scare him off. It got out of hand." Luis felt the room tilt. "We?" Mark stood suddenly, voice rising. "He was going to report," us said. "He already told Bellamy. But Bellamy, he didn't want any more trouble. Said it'd ruin our futures." "What did you do?" Mark didn't answer. Luis stared at him. "You helped cover up a man's death. That doesn't go away just because time passes." Mark sank back into his chair, looking older now, smaller. "I didn't bury him," he said quietly. Luis turned to leave. "No," he said over his shoulder, "you just locked the door and walked away." The next day, Luis brought everything to Detective Madden. The name, the confession, the yearbook photos. He slid the manila folder across her desk like it was something alive. She read in silence, flipping through the pages with the kind of care that told Luis she already suspected the truth. When she reached the summary of Luis's conversation with Mark Tolbert, she tapped her pen twice, slowly. "Did he say Dean Klein's name out loud?" Luis shook his head. "No, but he didn't have to. They were always together, and Harold told someone he saw 2 students that night. Dean was the other." Madden leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. "Tolbert's statement gives us a place to start, but it's not a confession. Not in legal terms, and unless he puts it in writing, it won't go far in court." "He admitted they scared Harold," Luis said. "He admitted Bellamy covered it up." She nodded. "But the man who ordered that cover-up is dead, and the boys are grown men now, with clean records and powerful families. This town doesn't like its ghost dragged out into the daylight." Luis folded his arms. "So what, we let it go?" "No," Madden said. "We do it carefully. We find Dean Klein. We find out what's still hiding behind that wall, because bones are one thing. But if there's something more? A note? A recording? Anything? She trailed off, eyes sharpening. That's what gets people to talk. Luis sat there for a moment, the silence stretching between them like a thread. I'm not going to stop, he said finally. I know, she replied. That's why I'm trusting you with this. That afternoon, they returned to the sublevel together. Forensics had cleared the space, but the air still felt like it held its breath. Madden stepped through the gap and walked slowly toward the back wall. She crouched, lifted something gently from beneath a fallen crate, and turned. A small cassette recorder. Dust-caked, labeled in faded ink. June 7, H.G. Luis stepped forward. Harold left his voice behind, he whispered. Madden looked down at the tape in her hands. Then maybe it's finally time we listen. The recorder was old, its plastic brittle and yellowed, the play button sticking when Madden pressed it down. At first, there was only static low, steady, like wind scraping across a microphone. Then came Harold's voice, distant but unmistakable, calm, careful. If you're hearing this, he said, it's because I didn't make it out. Luis felt the hair rise on his arms. I wasn't supposed to see anything. I just mopped the floors, fixed the leaks, keep my head down. But last night, I went to check the gym storage, the one where the fire was a few months back. Found it open again. Thought maybe some kids got in. There was a long pause, breathing, shuffling. Then Harold spoke again, quieter this time. I saw Mark Tolbert and Dean Klein dragging that same freshman kid Riley something into the closet. He was crying, blood on his face. I don't think they saw me. More silence. A small clink, like metal tapping glass. I told Principal Bellamy this morning. He said he'd handle it. But he looked scared. Not shocked, just scared. Luis glanced at Madden. Her jaw was tight, eyes fixed forward. I don't think they'll let me tell anyone else, Harold's voice continued. Bellamy warned me to stay quiet, said I didn't understand the bigger picture, said the school's reputation was worth more than one boy's truth. The tape crackled again. Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. If something happens to me, look in the old supply closet near the auditorium. I'm going to leave the keys there. And this tape. Someone has to know what really happened. The tape clicked to a stop. Nothing followed. No scream, no struggle. Just silence. Madden turned slowly, still holding the recorder. That freshman, Riley. You ever come across that name? Luis shook his head, throat dry. He's not in the yearbook. Not listed anywhere. They wiped it clean, she murmured. Luis swallowed hard. So Harold wasn't just collateral. He was a threat. Madden nodded. And he left us the truth. Outside, the summer light poured through the narrow windows, as if the building itself was finally exhaling. But in that basement, the air stayed still. 13 years of silence had just broken. And someone would have to answer for it. The name Riley clung to Luis's thoughts like a burr, that part of the tape Harold's hushed voice saying, Riley, something, felt like the thread that could unravel everything. If they could find him, verify his story, then Harold's death wouldn't just be a tragedy. It would be a crime with a witness. Madden requested access to old student discipline files, but most from that era had either been destroyed or conveniently misplaced. Still, she pulled every available student roster from the early 80s, cross-referenced enrollment changes, transfers, and any sudden disappearances that lined up with Harold's last year. It was Luis who found it tucked at the bottom of a box of handwritten attendance ledgers in the school archive room. A transfer slip, dated April 1983. Name, Riley S. Cotter. Grade, 9. Reason for transfer. Personal, family relocation. Destination, Little Rock Alternative Academy. No phone number, no follow-up file, just a name and a silent trail. Louise took it straight to Madden. She stared at it for a long moment. "Alternative Academy," she said. "That usually meant one thing back then. Someone wanted you gone. Fast." "Think he's still in Little Rock?" Louise asked. Madden nodded. "If he is, we'll find him." The following week was a blur. Madden filed a formal request with Little Rock PD to locate Riley Cotter. Days passed. Then, a call came through. Cotter had been found. He was living in a small apartment on the east side of the city, working nights at a warehouse. No family, no public record since a misdemeanor charge in '91. But when he was told someone had asked about Eisenhower High and the year 1983, he reportedly went pale and said, "It's about the janitor, isn't it?" Louise and Madden drove down 2 days later. They found Riley sitting at a kitchen table, cluttered with unpaid bills and cigarette burns. He didn't say hello, just stared at them for a long time and then asked, "You finally digging it up?" "We are," Madden said, "and we need your help." Riley swallowed, his hands trembling as he reached for a glass of water. "I thought no one ever would," he said. "But yeah, I remember everything." And just like that, Harold Granger had a witness. And the wall of silence, carefully built, brick by brick, began to crack. Riley Cotter's eyes didn't hold the wild defensiveness Louise expected. They held something far heavier: shame, the kind that never quite dries out. He was in his late 30s now, though his slouched posture and jittery movements made him seem younger and older all at once. "I didn't think anybody would come asking," he said, voice raspy from too many years and too many cigarettes. "I used to dream someone would, then I got used to thinking no one ever would." He sat back in the chair, eyes flicking between Louise and Detective Madden. "They told me to shut up. Said if I talked, my life would be over. I was 14. What was I supposed to do?" Madden didn't speak. She just waited. Riley nodded slowly, like he was finally giving himself permission to tell it. "It was a dare, a stupid one. I was small, soft, easy to pick on. They dragged me into the gym storage during lunch. Mark held me down while Dean cut open my backpack. Said they were looking for drugs, but it was just a show for the others. Then Dean burned my textbook with a lighter and shoved me into a mop bucket. Said, if I told anyone, next time it'd be me that caught fire." His fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles white. "I tried to get away, slipped on the wax. That's when Harold walked in." He paused, looked down, swallowed. He didn't yell, just stood there, took it all in. I remember the way he said, "That's enough." Just those 2 words, quiet, like he wasn't asking. Louise nodded, breath shallow. "He helped me up, cleaned me off, walked me to the nurse, told her I'd slipped on a floor wet from lunch cleanup. She looked at the bruises and didn't ask, but he told me he was going to report them." Madden leaned forward. "To Bellamy?" Riley nodded. Next day, Harold was gone. His voice cracked then, just a hair. "I thought it was my fault. For a long time, I thought I got him killed." Louise felt the air shift, like something terrible had finally stepped into the light. "You didn't," Madden said gently. "They did." And now, Riley Cotter's truth was going on record. The sworn statement took over an hour. Madden recorded it twice, once on tape, once in writing, and had Riley initial every page. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. The weight of his silence had calcified over the years, and now that it had cracked, everything poured out. After he signed the final page, Riley sat back in the chair, eyes red but dry. "What happens now?" Madden closed the folder. "Now we make it official. You've just become a witness in an open homicide case." Outside, the sky had turned the color of old copper, and the streets of Little Rock buzzed with a world that had no idea a decades-old secret had just been unearthed in a second-floor apartment. On the drive back, Louise sat quiet in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur by. He kept hearing Harold's voice from the tape. "If you're hearing this, it's because I didn't make it out." He had made it out, in a way his story had. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to bring the rest into the light. Madden broke the silence. This is bigger than two teenagers and a scared freshman. Luis looked at her. You think Bellamy buried other things? I think this wasn't his first cover-up. And I think the school board back then, some of them had to know. Construction doesn't happen without a paper trail. They may have erased files, but someone signed off. Luis thought about the welded door, the silence in the office when he first reported the closet, the way people looked the other way for 13 years. I think this place learned to forget on purpose, he said. They returned to the school just after dark. The building loomed in quiet silhouette, crime scene tape still fluttering at the edge of the east wing. Madden locked the case file in her trunk, then turned to Luis. You started something no one else was willing to, she said. You didn't have to open that door, but you did. Luis gave a tired half-smile. Somebody had to remember him. She nodded once. We'll get the rest, piece by piece. As she drove off, Luis lingered by the entrance, staring up at the windows of the darkened school. Somewhere in there, Harold had once clocked in for the last time. Now justice was finally clocking in for him. Word spread fast after Riley Cotter's statement was filed. By Thursday, local reporters weren't just hovering outside the school, they were digging. Old news clippings, board meeting minutes, obituaries. A photo surfaced in the Arkansas Gazette, archives from 1984. Principal Bellamy at a groundbreaking ceremony, flanked by two students in Letterman jackets. One of them was Mark Tolbert. The other, unmistakably, was Dean Klein. Luis stared at the grainy image in disbelief. They were honored? Community outreach, Madden said, dropping the photo onto her growing pile of evidence. Bellamy called them young leaders after the fire cleanup. Whole event was staged 2 weeks after Harold vanished. They were rewarded for it, Luis muttered. For their silence, Madden corrected. She tapped a manila envelope on her desk. We found Klein, lives outside Fort Worth now, works in commercial insurance. No criminal record, no social media. Will he talk? He'll have to. We're issuing a subpoena. The next morning, a grand jury was quietly assembled in the county courthouse. Madden submitted Harold's recorded message, Riley's statement, the maintenance records, and photographs of the sealed room. She told Luis to stay back for now, but promised to update him the moment the charges were filed. He spent the day walking the school's halls like a man in someone else's memory. Students were returning soon, and the administration was racing to restore normalcy, paint over the tape, patch the drywall, refinish the floor, as if bricks and polish could erase the truth. He stood outside the supply closet again, the one he'd opened by accident, and stared at the handle. So ordinary, so small, and yet it had opened something far bigger than he ever imagined. Later that night, Madden called. We got Klein, she said. He didn't deny anything, claimed it was an accident, said they shoved Harold, he hit his head on a pipe. Bellamy told them to stay quiet, said he'd take care of it. Luis closed his eyes, the image forming immediately Harold on the ground, bleeding, while boys in panic and a principal in a suit decided how to make it disappear. They're pressing charges? He asked. Yes. Officially, this is now a homicide investigation. Luis said nothing for a long time. Finally, he whispered, he can finally rest now. And for the first time, he meant it. The courthouse smelled like old wood and dust, the kind of air that held its breath. Luis sat on the last bench in the back of the courtroom, hands clasped between his knees, listening as the charges were read aloud. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, accessory to homicide. One count after another, names etched into the silence: Mark Tolbert and Dean Klein. Neither man looked back at him. Mark sat stiff, jaw clenched, as though posture alone could shield him from consequence. Dean looked smaller than his yearbook photos had suggested, sunken in his suit, pale, like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Riley Cotter testified through a closed session, his identity protected. The courtroom hushed when Madden submitted Harold's cassette recording. For 32 seconds, everyone sat frozen as the dead man's voice filled the room, calm and certain, naming the people who would rather silence him than risk the truth. Afterward, the judge sat in silence for a long time. No one dared shift in their seat. Outside, reporters gathered like flies, their questions sharp and fast. Luis stepped through them quietly, unnoticed. That evening, he returned to the school one last time. The crime scene tape was gone, the closet sealed again, but now with reverence, not concealment. A temporary placard had been placed beside it by order of the district, in memory of Harold E. Granger. 1946-1984. A man who spoke the truth and paid the price. May he never be forgotten. Luis stood in front of it, a warm breeze trailing down the hallway. For a moment, he could almost hear the wheels of Harold's mop cart, the soft rhythm of a man who took care of what others left behind. The school felt different now, not lighter, but honest. Marisol met him outside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," she said, handing one over. Luis looked back at the building. "We did, and so did Harold." She smiled. "You ready to go home?" He nodded, finally. Because now, Harold Granger wasn't just the janitor who vanished. He was the man who saw something wrong and didn't look away. 2 weeks later, the town held a memorial. It wasn't in the school gym like it should have been. The district said it was inappropriate, while legal proceedings were still active, so Mrs. Delaney arranged it herself at the old public library, in a meeting room that smelled like paper and time, folding chairs, coffee in styrofoam cups. A stack of Harold's faded personnel papers laid out like offerings. Only a few people came. Some former students, 2 retired teachers, a groundskeeper who hadn't spoken to Luis in years. And Riley Cotter, sitting quietly in the back, hands tucked in his lap like a child again. He didn't speak, but when his eyes met Luis's, he nodded, just once. That was enough. Mrs. Delaney stood and read a passage from one of the journals Harold had scribbled in, left behind in a crack behind the boiler room. "I don't need a spotlight, I just want to be useful. A place can't stay clean if no one's willing to sweep the corners." Her voice cracked halfway through. She sat down before she finished, tears sliding down the corners of her jaw like they'd waited too long to fall. Afterward, people took turns sharing memories that had never been said aloud. A hallway conversation. A time Harold fixed a kid's broken backpack strap without being asked. The way he always brought extra gloves when it snowed, just in case. Luis stood last. He hadn't planned to speak, but his feet moved anyway. When he looked out at the small, quiet room, his voice came softer than he expected. "I didn't know him," he said. "Not really. But I knew his shadow. I knew the silence that filled the space where his name should have been." He paused, throat tight. "And I know that it mattered. That someone noticed. That someone said, 'That's enough.'" After the memorial, they walked outside. The sky was the color of slate, thunderclouds gathering low and wide. Marisol took Luis's hand. "You gave him back his name." "No," Luis said, watching the wind scatter dry leaves across the steps. "He never lost it, they just made us forget." The rain came gently then, like something being washed clean. The rain lasted through the weekend, steady and patient, as if the town itself needed a long rinse. Luis spent most of it inside, sitting at his kitchen table, going over the last few items from Harold's file. Most of it was routine supply orders, handwritten logs, notes in the margins about squeaky hinges and light bulbs that needed changing, but one page had something different. A list, written in shaky block letters. Names, no titles, just first names. Donnie, Rhonda, James, Ellie, Riley, beside each, a single word, witness. Afraid. Missing. Left. Still here. Luis circled the last one. Still here. He didn't know who it meant. Maybe himself, maybe Delaney, maybe someone who still hadn't come forward. He folded the page and slid it into a fresh folder. Not a file to be buried, but something living, something to carry forward. On Monday morning, school resumed. Students filled the halls again. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked against polished linoleum. The buzz of normalcy returned, but something had shifted. The janitor's closet near the auditorium remained sealed, but this time by Choiseneau to hide something, but to honor it. A new plaque had been installed beside it, simple, brass, engraved with Harold's full name and the words, "He saw what others looked past." Some students stopped to read it. Most walked by without a glance, the way they might pass a fire alarm or a cracked tile. But a few lingered. Luis noticed them. He didn't interrupt. He kept to his work, replacing a flickering light in the cafeteria, adjusting a broken hinge in the library door. The kind of small, quiet tasks Harold used to do. Mrs. Delaney found him during lunch. She handed him a manila envelope. Inside were copies of the pages Harold had written. "In case someone else asks someday," she said. "They will," Luis said. "Eventually." The bell rang overhead, echoing down the halls, the same way it had the day Harold disappeared. But now it felt different. Not an ending, but a continuation. Luis looked out across the hallway as students flooded from classrooms, laughter bouncing off the walls. This time, when the bell echoed, someone would remember. The sun rose slow over Eisenhower High, brushing gold against the rooftop as if reluctant to touch a place that had held so much darkness. The school looked the same: brick walls, chain-link fence, white paint flaking from windowsills, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Truth had seeped into the foundation. Luis unlocked the maintenance shed just after 6. He moved through his morning quietly, pushing his cart down the same hallway Harold once did. The floors hummed with early light, lockers still closed, the building exhaling before the day began. He passed the auditorium supply closet, the one he'd opened by accident, and paused, just for a second. The brass plaque caught the sun, Harold's name glinting warm against the wall. Luis reached out and touched it with his fingers, not for ritual, but out of something simpler: gratitude. Detective Madden called him later that morning. Tolbert and Klein had taken plea deals: voluntary manslaughter, conspiracy to obstruct. No courtroom dramatics, just quiet accountability. It wasn't enough, not really, but it was something. Their names would be public, their legacy tied to the truth they buried. After lunch, Luis found a note taped to the janitor's office door. It was from a sophomore named Elena. Just a scrap of lined paper, pencil written, folded twice. "My uncle was Riley Cotter. Thank you for helping tell the story. People didn't believe him, they will now." He folded the note and placed it inside the envelope with Harold's records. Not to archive, to carry forward. That afternoon, a new student asked where the vending machines were. Luis walked her there, then lingered nearby, watching her punch in numbers, laughing at a stuck soda can. He saw Harold in that moment, in the act of simply being there, a witness, a quiet guard against what others didn't see. When the final bell rang, the hallway filled with motion and noise and life. Luis stood beside the supply closet, the plaque catching the fading light once again. And in that moment, the school didn't feel haunted. It felt honest. Harold Granger was no longer a rumor sealed behind a wall. He was remembered. And finally he was free.